Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, March 7th, 2013. I'm sorry about the 2-week hiatus with the news and views, folks. I've been in the midst of another transition, and hopefully everything's settled down. On top of that, I got really, really sick. So anyway, a couple of announcements for you. We do have a members vid chat scheduled for tomorrow, and as of now I'm going to go through it. I feel well enough. Yesterday I felt so rotten that I literally slept the whole day, and even at the end of that I was still feeling rotten and tired. I've had a bit of the flu, so hopefully we'll make it tomorrow. But anyway, the second announcement is I have just contracted with Adventures Unlimited Press for the sequel to Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. And, excuse me, that will be called Covert Wars and the Clash of Civilizations. The subtitle of that is UFOs, Oligarchs, and Space Secrecy. So I've already started researching and doing a little bit of writing on that. Once again, David has decided to put up a due-out date on Amazon of October 15th. Cross your fingers, because it seems I'm in the same position I was with Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. That means I'm going to have to finish a book in jig time to get it to him so that he can get it to the printer and then in turn to the distributors. Second major announcement is Dr. DeHart and I are already discussing the sequel to Yahweh the Two-Faced God. I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago, or maybe almost a month ago, but we are talking about it. We are doing research on it slowly but surely, so hopefully we'll be able to get that out. And finally, I am beginning to research the sequel to The Financial Vipers of Venice, and also another book. So I'm actually working kind of on 4 books all simultaneously right now. 2 of them are kind of long-term projects, so it's not as if I'm overwhelmed or anything. For the moment, my immediate attention is on the sequel to Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. I have to thank a lot of you for your kind reviews of that book. Frankly, I did not think that it was one of my better efforts, but that I think was largely due to the fact that I felt so rushed. Hopefully this one will be a bit better and tie up some loose ends that I didn't get to in the other book. Now, what I want to talk about in this news and views, and if this goes long, I may make a part 2, and that way we'll make up for the lack of the news and views of the previous 2 weeks. I want to talk more about the Papal resignation, and also about the Chelyabinsk Meteor. All right, both of these really fascinate me, and a lot of you have been sending just an enormous amount of material on both subjects to me, and I have been looking it over. It's just I don't have time to comment on each and everything that each of you sends me, but I have been looking at those 2 stories in particular. And I want to start off with the Pope and with his resignation, because the more information that is slowly coming out, the more I think we're dealing with a very significant story. There are, as of now, as far as I can tell, at least 3 different memes as to why the Pope resigned. And each one of them, you'll notice, is more or less sort of suggesting that he resigned due to pressure. In other words, that he was literally blackmailed into resigning. Now, the first of these memes suggests that there is even murkier financial dealings between the Vatican Bank and J.P. Morgan Chase, particularly with J.P. Morgan Chase handling the Vatican Bank's gold accounts. Now that right there, folks, should set off alarm bells in a major way. Because if you recall, in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, I talked about the fact that a lot of that Operation Golden Lily Japanese bullion loot was laundered by the Japanese imperial family through the Vatican Bank. Now that's significant. in so many ways. Because, first of all, I've been arguing for a long time now that the amount of gold bullion in actual existence in the world is massively obfuscated, perhaps by one order of magnitude, and that it may be the case that there's a lot more gold bullion in existence than they're letting on. That would certainly seem to be the case as suggested by the Japanese plundering of Asia during World War II. All of that gold, in my estimation, has been rehypothecated so many times, however, that it has functioned as the basis of a vastly huge and vastly fraudulent system of finance within the Western world, a system largely hidden and for the purposes of funding covert operations on the one hand as a kind of a political slush fund that's totally off the books, and then secondly as a mechanism, a funding mechanism for super secret research that exists outside even the black budget processes of the American government. So in other words, we are dealing with something totally within the control of the intelligence agencies of the West, and more particularly of the United States, and more or less completely independent of the central banks of the West. So that's very significant. Now, with J.P. Morgan's connection to the Vatican Bank, then this would make them complicit, or at least imply their complicity in all of this gold rehypothecation. So in other words, we're looking at a tip of an iceberg here financially that may involve the Vatican to a degree that even the scandals of the 1980s with P2 and Michela Sindona and Roberto Calvi, that even those scandals are not quite to the depth of this. Now, the second possibility with the Pope's resignation has concerned allegations of a network of, number one, gays or homosexual clergy within the Vatican, or two, a network of pedophilia within the Vatican. And I suspect that each of those things has its own deeper connection to what I've long suspected, although I have no evidence for this, but that I've long suspected is a worldwide child slavery, child sex, pedophilia sort of ring that is being used by the power elite for several purposes. Number one, to blackmail those within the elite to do their bidding by ensnaring them in acts of pedophilia and so on and so forth, and also at a much deeper and much more murky level. Sadly to say, I think my suspicion is that this may be tied to actual ritual sex magic practice. So now there's no evidence for this whatsoever, but I want to point out that Father Malachi Martin, in his last book that he wrote, it was a novel called Windswept House, he very strongly hints at the existence of such a network inside the Vatican. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I suspect that there's some truth in it because of some things that I ran across in researching Financial Vipers of Venice that you'll just have to wait for that book to come out before you see what I'm talking about. But I do suspect that there has been an element within the Vatican elite that has been plugged into networks of other elites for quite some time, namely Freemasonry, Illuminism, and so on and so forth, and even, for that matter, if you go much further back, with Templarism. So I suspect that we're dealing with all of these factors with the Pope's resignation. Now, all of that leads me to suspect even more strongly that we have to watch very carefully how the cardinals elect and who they elect for the next Pope. I think that there's a strong possibility, as I've mentioned before, that the next Pope will be an attempt, a deliberate attempt, to fulfill the prophecies of Malachi. Time will tell. I do not think that we are going to get a caretaker Pope. I think the next Pope will be young. But if it is an older Pope, then that means that they've settled again on a transitional candidate like Benedict XVI, while they're still jockeying for position to establish the real long-term goals of the Vatican and of the Roman Church. So that's something to watch. Now I want to turn to something completely different, and that's the Chelyabinsk meteor. That happened right at the beginning of this, excuse me, of this period of transition that I've been in, and I've been wanting to comment because when the incident first happened, excuse me, I was strongly suspicious that we were looking at least in part, an event that was not entirely natural. Now, my suspicion began when it was Chelyabinsk itself that was reported as being the site for this incident. Chelyabinsk, as has now emerged, is a major center for Russian nuclear activity, for Russian nuclear waste storage, nuclear research, and so on and so forth. And as has also subsequently emerged now on Russian TV, there are stories, news stories being aired in Russia about how apparently the meteor was exploded very deliberately, by whom the Russians are not yet saying. I suspect the Russians themselves may have shot this down with an anti-missile battery that they had deployed close to Chelyabinsk. I suspect that. Now, the reason I say this is that a number of people are already pointing out that the meteor came in at a very odd angle to Chelyabinsk, and that there were numerous UFO sightings in the Ural Mountains prior to the meteor strike. Now, that fuels a lot of speculation, but here's the clincher for me that says that this may not have been an entirely natural event. And I'll link this article, but I want you to look at that. This is from RT, Russia to spend billions on asteroid defense. And this occurred, this story was run by RT prior to the Chelyabinsk incident. And it's very interesting that what it's talking about here is an actual space defense system against asteroids, against meteors. And the subtext here is implied, but it's not specifically spelled out, against asteroids or meteors that are being deliberately targeted at Earth. And that's the key here. Excuse me, folks. Now, it states, quote, Russian scientists have presented a federal program designed to counteract space threats. Elaborated by the Institute of Astronomy at Russia's Academy of Science and the Central Engineering Research Institute, Russia's leading space industry enterprise, the program has already been approved by Roscosmos, the National Space Agency. Now, the key word in there for me is threats, all right? In other words, prior to the Chelyabinsk incident, Russia was pointing out its willingness to unilaterally, and this is what I find fascinating, to unilaterally deploy a system of asteroid defense against space threats. Now, folks, this reminds me all too much of the von Braun-Rosen affidavit. You recall that Dr. Carol Rosen, pardon me, that Dr. Carol Rosen maintained that Dr. Werner von Braun told her prior to his death that the plan in order to militarize space was first of all to talk about the danger from communist Russia or the Soviet Union, then to talk about terrorism, then nations of concern, then asteroids, and then finally aliens. So in other words, Russia is already on the second to the last page of that script. And the word threats there implies, and the Chelyabinsk meteor brought it home with a vengeance, so to speak, that as far as Russia is concerned, they might, in their thinking, be dealing with a threat that stems from the capability to take rocks, space objects, asteroids, meteors, and deliberately target them to regions on the surface of the Earth. That's the way I'm reading this Russian response. Now, what does that mean in terms of Chelyabinsk? Well, I think there's only two ways, if we look at it in terms of the high-octane speculation model, that there's only two ways that we can look at it. If we assume that the meteor was a natural object that was deliberately targeted, then the persons or organizations doing the targeting either have to be terrestrial or non-terrestrial, and the exploding of the meteor either has to be terrestrial or non-terrestrial. Now, I think personally the Russians blew it up. They, in other words, picked an object and gave the world a demonstration of their ability and their capability, and announced in major terms prior to that they have even bigger plans in mind. Now, what that means is the Russians are signaling their willingness to engage the West, in my opinion, in a new space race. It also means, I think, that the Russians may be saying, we know that there's somebody out there, whether based on the Earth or not, that has capabilities that we can only dream about. So I suspect we're also looking at, with the Chelyabinsk meteor, at the first possible stage in a gradual disclosure, and I'm using that word very deliberately, in a gradual disclosure of technological capabilities that are in the possession of humans. The Chelyabinsk meteor was a message. I think it was a message, first of all, from someone to the Russians, but I think also it was a message by the Russians to that someone. Excuse me. So this is one to watch, folks. This story, I think, is going to be elaborated in the coming years. We're going to see similar incidents, so it's one to watch. Anyway, that's it for my news and views for Thursday, March 7th, 2013. Thanks for tuning in, folks. I apologize again about the hiatus. For those of you members, we do have a members vid chat tomorrow night that's scheduled depending on how I feel. If I wake up and feel lousy, I'll post a notice on my Facebook page. Anyway, thanks everybody. God bless, and we'll see you on the flip side.